The smell of floor wax and old flowers hit me the second I walked into the funeral home. My grandmother's service had run nearly 2 hours, which was 1 hour and 40 minutes longer than anyone actually needed. By the time we got back to my parents' house in Charlotte, the casseroles were cold and the relatives were restless, picking at food and pretending to grieve while their eyes drifted toward my uncle, the family attorney. My brother, Marcus, had been working the room since we arrived. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, moving from cluster to cluster, laughing just a little too easily for a man who had supposedly just lost his grandmother. His wife, Diana, floated alongside him in a black dress that was far too expensive for a Tuesday afternoon funeral, touching people on the arm, nodding slowly, performing grief the way someone performs a PowerPoint presentation. I poured myself a glass of water and stayed where I was. When my uncle finally cleared his throat and asked everyone to gather in the living room, Marcus practically jogged to the front row. Diana arranged herself beside him, with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the picture of patience. I took the chair nearest the door. My uncle read slowly, adjusting his glasses between each item. The beach condo in Myrtle Beach, Marcus. The investment accounts split between Marcus and my mother, the furniture, the jewelry, the savings bonds, all listed, all allocated, all landing squarely in places that made Marcus's smile grow incrementally wider with each sentence. Then my uncle turned a page. To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave the property on Miller Creek Road. The greenhouse, the surrounding 12 acres, and everything on it. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Marcus turned to look at me. For 1 second, his expression was unreadable. Then it settled into something that I recognized from childhood, that particular tilt of his chin that meant he had already categorized something as beneath him. A greenhouse, he said. Not to me exactly, but loud enough that everyone could hear. Of course. Perfect for you, Sarah. You always did love playing in the dirt. Diana laughed softly, pressing her fingers to her lips like she was trying to hold it back. I kept my face still. My uncle continued reading, but I had stopped hearing the words. I was watching Marcus lean toward Diana and whisper something that made her shoulders shake. Whatever he said, it was enough to make 2 of my cousins glance over at me with that particular look, the one that sits somewhere between pity and amusement. I had inherited a falling-apart greenhouse on a piece of land 2 hours from anywhere that mattered. My brother had inherited enough to retire on, and he thought it was funny. The thing about growing up with a brother like Marcus is that you learn very early how to absorb impact without showing it. By the time we were teenagers, I had developed a kind of internal armor that sealed off my reactions before they reached my face. It came from years of having things I loved quietly mocked until I learned not to love them visibly. My garden in the backyard, my science fair projects, the scholarship I won that he dismissed as not that competitive. So I sat in that chair by the door with my water glass and I let the reading finish, and I thanked my uncle and I stayed long enough to eat half a casserole, and then I said I had an early shift at the hospital and I left. Marcus caught me at the door. Hey. He said it casually, like we were wrapping up a normal family dinner. You should really think about just signing it over. The greenhouse, the land, all of it. Diana and I know a developer who's been buying up rural parcels in that county. We could all come out ahead. I looked at him. Grandma left it to me. He shrugged. The kind of shrug that meant he had already decided the answer. She left it to you because she felt sorry for you, Sarah. You know that, right? You're single, you're renting, you work nights at a hospital. She thought it would give you something, but it's not going to give you anything. That property is falling apart. It hasn't been operational in 15 years. Then why do you want it? Something flickered in his expression. He recovered quickly. I'm trying to help you. I'll think about it, I said, and walked out to my car. I did not think about it. I drove home, sat on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes, and then I looked up the address my uncle had written on the paperwork. Miller Creek Road, Harmon County, Georgia. 2 hours southeast, deep rural. The kind of county where the gas station is also the post office. I had never been there. My grandmother had never mentioned it to me directly, not once in 30 years. And yet, she had left it to me specifically, deliberately, by name, while my brother walked away with the beach condo and the investment accounts. She had a reason. I was sure of it. I just didn't know what it was yet. I called in for 3 days of personal time, packed a bag, and drove south. The GPS lost confidence about 20 minutes before I arrived, offering increasingly tentative suggestions as the roads narrowed and the tree cover thickened. By the time I turned onto Miller Creek Road, the pavement had given way to packed gravel. On either side, Georgia pines pressed close, blocking out the late afternoon sun in patches. The property appeared at the end of a long, curved driveway. I stopped the car and sat there with the engine running. The greenhouse was larger than I had expected, a long glass and iron structure that must have been beautiful once. Several panes were missing now, replaced by plywood or just left open to the weather. The iron frame had gone a deep rust orange. Beside it stood a small farmhouse, similarly tired, with a porch that sagged on one end and shutters hanging crooked on the upper windows. But the land around it, 12 acres of it, rolling toward a creek I could hear but not yet see, dense with old-growth hardwoods and open meadow in the places where trees gave way. Even in the gray November light, it had a quality to it, something that pressed back against the shabbiness of the buildings and insisted on its own dignity. I got out of the car and stood in the cold air for a long moment. Then I went inside. The farmhouse smelled like cedar and dried earth, and something faintly floral I couldn't identify. The electricity still worked, which surprised me. Someone had maintained the utilities. The furniture was old but not ruined: a square wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the back room with a quilt folded at the foot of it, a wood-burning stove in the corner with a fresh stack of splits beside it. Someone had been taking care of this place. I walked through each room slowly. In the kitchen, I found a tin of coffee and a note tucked under it in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Coffee's fresh. Welcome, neighbor. Vera. 2 properties over. Your grandmother called me when she got sick, said to keep an eye on things." I read the note twice, then put the kettle on. Before the water boiled, there was a knock at the door. The woman on the porch was somewhere in her late 60s, compact and sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled straight back, and the kind of posture that suggested she had opinions and wasn't afraid to share them. She was holding a covered pot. "Vera Hutchins," she said, before I could speak. "I made soup. You look like you drove straight through." "I did," I said. "I'm Sarah. I know who you are. Eleanor talked about you. She said my grandmother's name like they had been close. You going to let me in, or are we doing this on the porch?" I stepped aside. She moved into the kitchen with the comfort of someone who had been there before, setting the pot on the stove and turning the burner on like she owned the place. I didn't mind. There was something steadying about her efficiency. "Your grandmother came here every summer until about 6 years ago," Vera said, ladling soup into a bowl she found without searching for it. "She stopped when her hip got bad, but she never stopped paying the taxes, never let the title lapse, never told a soul outside the family that she owned it." "She never told me," I said. Vera looked up from the bowl. "She told you what you needed to know, when you needed to know it." Eleanor was particular about timing. I sat down at the table and wrapped my hands around the bowl. "Do you know why she left it to me? Instead of my brother?" Vera sat across from me and folded her hands on the table. "She said she knew which one of her grandchildren would understand what this place meant and which one would sell it before the ink dried." Something tightened in my chest. "He already asked me to sign it over," I said. Vera nodded, unsurprised. "He called me, actually, 2 days after Eleanor passed. Asked if I knew anything about the property value. I told him I was just a neighbor and I didn't know much about real estate." She paused. That was not entirely true. I looked at her. She held my gaze and said, "Your grandmother asked me to show you something when you arrived. She said you'd come within a week, and she was right." She was usually right. Vera stood, and I followed her through the farmhouse and out the back door toward the greenhouse. Up close, the structure was even larger than it had seemed from the driveway, 40 feet wide, easily 100 feet long. Vera produced a key and unlocked the main door, which swung open smoothly despite the rust on the frame. Inside, it was warmer than outside. The remaining glass panels trapped the day's heat, and the smell hit me immediately: green and wet and dense, the smell of living things. Because inside that greenhouse, things were still growing. Not wild overgrowth or weeds. Careful, deliberate, maintained. Row after row of orchids in ceramic pots. ranging from small pale clusters to enormous specimens with flowers the size of my hand in colors that didn't seem real: deep burgundy edged in gold, pale green streaked with violet, white so pure it seemed to generate its own light. I stopped walking. "Vera," I said slowly, "how many are there, currently?" She walked down the center aisle with the ease of someone who had been here countless times. A little over 200 distinct specimens. Some of them are common enough. But some of them— she paused at a shelf near the back and gestured to a cluster of small pale flowers I didn't recognize— are not common at all. I leaned closer. The flowers were almost translucent, with a lip patterned in burgundy that looked hand-painted. "What is this one?" "Paphiopedilum rothschildianum," Vera said. "Lady's slipper orchid, one of the rarest in cultivation. A single mature specimen like this one sells at auction for upward of $5,000. She looked at me steadily. "Your grandmother had 11 of them, go." I straightened up slowly. "She built this collection over 40 years, Vera continued. Quietly. Carefully. She never talked about it at family gatherings because she said she didn't want it to become something people argued over. She wanted it to go to someone who'd understand what it was." She paused. "And the orchids aren't even the most valuable thing here." She led me to the far end of the greenhouse, where a metal shelving unit held not plants but files, binders, and folders, organized by year, going back decades. She pulled one out and handed it to me. It was a water rights survey. Official documentation, surveyed and filed, granting ownership of the water source feeding Miller Creek to the holder of the Miller Creek Road property. "This creek feeds 4 downstream properties," Vera said. 2 of them are large agricultural operations that have been purchasing water access rights from your grandmother for years. The payments go into an account she set up." She tapped the binder. "The documentation is all here. The account information is in the back. As of last month, there was just under $400,000 in it." I sat down on a wooden stool that happened to be behind me. "She never mentioned any of this," I said. "She mentioned it to the right person," Vera said. "That's different." I sat there in that warm glass room, surrounded by 200 orchids my grandmother had grown for 40 years in secret, and I thought about Marcus in his expensive suit at the front of the funeral home, laughing with Diana about my greenhouse. I thought about his hand on my arm at the door. "You should really think about just signing it over." My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Marcus." I let it ring. That night, I slept in the narrow bed under my grandmother's quilt, and I did not sleep well, but not because I was troubled. I was thinking, running through everything Vera had shown me, mapping it the way I mapped a patient's chart at the beginning of a shift, looking for the full picture, not just the presenting information. By morning, I had a clearer sense of what I was holding. The water rights alone generated income. The orchid collection, properly appraised and either maintained or selectively sold, represented 6 figures at minimum. The land itself, 12 acres in a county that Vera said had seen significant interest from conservation groups and land trusts, had independent value beyond anything on the surface. My grandmother had not left me a falling-apart greenhouse. She had left me a carefully assembled, deliberately hidden portfolio, and she had hidden it precisely because she knew that the wrong person would dissolve it the moment it came to light. Marcus called 4 more times before noon. I answered on the 5th. "Sarah." His voice was bright, which meant he had prepared. "I wanted to follow up on what we talked about at Mom's. Diana and I have been doing some research, and the developer I mentioned is serious. He's offering a fair number for the parcel. You wouldn't have to deal with any of it, no repairs, no maintenance, nothing." "What's the number?" I said. A brief pause. "He's thinking 120, maybe 130 if we push him. $120,000 for 12 acres, a greenhouse, and everything in it." "I'll think about it," I said. "Sarah." His tone shifted slightly. "I know you feel some kind of attachment to it because Grandma left it to you, but realistically you're a nurse. You work nights. You don't have the time or the resources to manage a rural property. This is a practical decision, not an emotional one." "You're right that I'm a nurse," I said. "We're trained to look at all the information before we make a decision. I'm still gathering mine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Don't be difficult about this." "I'm not being difficult," I said pleasantly. "I'm being thorough. I'll be in touch." I hung up and went to find Vera. She was in her garden next door, which was immaculate in the way that only decades of attention produces. She saw me coming over the fence line and straightened up, reading my face. "He called," she said, "offered me $120 for everything." Vera made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "The water rights contract alone is worth more than that." "I know that now," I said. "I need a lawyer." She pointed toward town. "Patricia Okafor, Main Street, above the hardware store." She handled Eleanor's estate documents locally. She knows the situation. I drove into town that afternoon. Patricia Okafor was in her 40s, methodical and direct. With reading glasses she took on and off as she moved between documents. She had a copy of my grandmother's full estate paperwork already pulled when I arrived, which told me she had been expecting me too. "Your grandmother was organized," Patricia said, spreading papers across her desk. "Everything is properly recorded and filed. The water rights transfer is airtight. The greenhouse contents are listed as personal property included with the real estate transfer." She looked up. "Your brother has no legal claim to any of it. He's talking about challenging the will." Patricia's expression didn't change. "He can try." "Your grandmother's attorney documented her mental clarity at the time of signing. 2 witnesses, notarized, no codicils that would create ambiguity. He'd be spending money on a case he'd lose, but he could still drag it out. He could try to. But courts tend to move quickly on estate challenges that have no evidentiary basis." She set down her glasses. "My advice is to file the water rights transfer paperwork this week, get the property formally in your name, and document everything on that greenhouse, a full inventory and appraisal. Once it's all on record, there's nothing to contest." I nodded. "Can you make the referral for the appraisal?" "I already have someone in mind," she said. Driving back to the property that evening, I passed a truck parked just off the driveway entrance. 2 men stood beside it, one holding a clipboard, both looking toward the greenhouse. Neither of them looked like farmers. I pulled in and got out. "Can I help you?" I said. The one with the clipboard smiled with teeth. "Just checking out some parcels in the area. We work with Summit Development Group. We had an inquiry about this property and thought we'd take a preliminary look." "An inquiry from who?" He glanced at his partner. "We were given to understand it was a family holding, currently under review." "It's not a family holding," I said. "It belongs to me. And right now, you're standing at the edge of my driveway without my permission. I'd like you to leave." They left without argument, but slowly. The kind of slowly that was designed to communicate that they weren't concerned about me. I went inside and called Marcus. "You sent developers to my property," I said. "I sent them to look at the parcel, Sarah." "It's not. Without telling me. Without my permission." "Marcus, you do not have any interest in this property. Grandma's will is not ambiguous. If you send people here again without my explicit invitation, I will file a no trespassing notice with the county, and the next time your people show up, I'll call the sheriff." Silence. "You're being irrational," he said finally. "I'm being clear," I said. "There's a difference." I hung up, and then I did what I should have done from the beginning. I called Mom. She answered carefully, the way she always answered when she suspected a difficult conversation was coming. "Sarah, honey." "Mom, did you know Marcus sent developers here without asking me?" A pause that lasted 2 beats too long. "He mentioned he was trying to help figure out the property situation. He's trying to take something that Grandma left to me specifically, and you've been letting him tell you it's fine because it's easier than disagreeing with him. That's not fair. Is it not?" I kept my voice even. "When was the last time you said something when Marcus dismissed me?" "At the funeral reading. In front of everyone? When he made that comment in front of the whole family?" She went quiet. "I love you," I said, "but I'm asking you to look at what's actually happening. Grandma made a decision. It was her property and her choice. And I need you to respect it even if Marcus doesn't." There was a long silence on the line. Then she said, very softly, "What did she leave you, Sarah?" "He keeps saying it's just an old greenhouse." "I'll show you," I said. "Come down next weekend. I want you to see it." She came. I picked her up at the end of Miller Creek Road on a Saturday morning, and I watched her face as we pulled up to the property, the skepticism she was trying to hide, the way her eyes moved across the sagging porch and the rust-stained greenhouse frame. Then I took her inside. I had spent the week with the appraiser, a specialist Vera had recommended, who had spent 2 full days documenting every specimen in the greenhouse. His preliminary numbers were still ringing in my head when I opened the main door and let Mom walk through. She stopped 3 steps in. The orchids were lit by the winter sun coming through the glass, the healthy panels, of which there were still many, and the effect was something close to overwhelming. Rows of color and shape that didn't look like they belonged in rural Georgia, didn't look like they belonged in a greenhouse, looked instead like something that should be behind glass in a museum. Eleanor grew these, Mom said, barely a question, for 40 years. I said. She never mentioned it to anyone at family gatherings because she was afraid of exactly what's happening now. Mom walked slowly down the center aisle. I followed. At the shelf with the ladies' slipper orchids, she stopped and bent close. Are these the ones that are rare? The appraiser valued those 11 specimens at between $55,000 and $70,000. Combined. She straightened slowly. Sarah. And that's before the water rights income, before the land value. I said it calmly, not triumphantly. I didn't want to win a point. I wanted her to understand. Grandma didn't leave me a consolation prize. She left me something she spent her whole life building, because she trusted me with it. Mom's eyes were filling. Marcus doesn't know any of this. Marcus offered me $120,000 for all of it, I said. The appraiser's preliminary figure for the collection alone is over $200,000. That's before the land, before the water rights account. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I'm not angry at you, I said, but I need you to understand what's been happening. He's been trying to push me out of something that's legally and rightfully mine, and he's been counting on you to help him do it. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she reached out and took my hand, and we stood there in the middle of my grandmother's greenhouse, while winter light moved through the glass above us. I didn't know, she said finally. I should have looked closer. I should have asked more questions instead of just, she stopped. I'm sorry, Sarah. I know, I said. 2 days later, Marcus arrived. I had not invited him, but I had expected it. He pulled up in the early afternoon in his truck, which was a recent and expensive model, and he got out with the easy confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. I was on the porch. I didn't go inside. We need to talk, he said, coming up the drive. We can talk here. He looked at the porch and then looked at me and then came up the steps anyway, stopping a few feet away. Mom called me. She said the greenhouse has some kind of orchid collection worth money. It does. You should have told me that from the beginning. His voice had the particular edge it got when he felt he had been kept from something he deserved. If Grandma had assets we didn't know about, that affects the entire estate. It doesn't affect the estate, I said. The estate was distributed according to Grandma's will. The greenhouse and everything in it was left to me. Patricia Okafor has the full documentation. The transfer is already filed with the county. He blinked. He had not expected me to have moved that quickly. Sarah, she chose me, Marcus. I kept my voice flat and steady. I know that's hard to accept, but it's the truth. She built that collection for 40 years, and she made a decision about who she trusted with it. You can be angry about that, or you can accept it. But either way, it's done. You're being selfish. I'm keeping what I was given. There are other people in this family who all received something, I said. You received the beach condo. You received the investment accounts. You received more than I did, actually, in straightforward monetary value. What you didn't receive was this. And that was her choice. He stared at me. For a moment, something shifted in his expression, not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like he was recalculating. I'll challenge the collection as estate assets, he said. But the certainty in his voice had slipped. Patricia is prepared for that, I said. So is the original estate attorney. Grandma's documentation is thorough. You'll spend more fighting it than you'd ever recover. I paused. I think you know that, Marcus. I think that's actually what you're realizing right now. The silence stretched out. Then he turned and went down the porch steps and got in his truck. He sat there for a minute before starting the engine. When he drove away, he didn't look back. I stood on the porch and listened to the truck sound fade down the gravel road. The creek murmured somewhere beyond the trees. Above the greenhouse, a hawk turned slowly in a cold blue sky. Vera appeared at the fence line with her hands in her jacket pockets. "You're going to need a plan for that greenhouse," she called over. "You can't let those orchids sit untended." "I know," I said. "I've been thinking about that." I had been thinking about it since the appraiser's first day, actually. He had walked me through the collection with the careful enthusiasm of someone in the presence of something remarkable. And somewhere in the middle of his explanation of propagation cycles and cultivation requirements, I had understood something my grandmother must have understood decades ago. This was not just a collection. It was a practice. It was the result of sustained attention paid to living things over a very long time. I thought about the community garden program at the hospital, the social work team had been trying to expand for years, with no funding and no space. I thought about the patients I had seen over 7 years of night shifts, recovering from surgeries and procedures in rooms that had nothing alive in them. I thought about what you could do with 200 orchids, 12 acres, a creek, and time. The plan came together over the following months in the way that real plans do not all at once, but in pieces, each one connecting to the next until the shape of the whole became clear. Patricia helped with the nonprofit filing. Vera connected me with a master gardener at the county extension office who knew orchid cultivation. The Orchid Society, when I contacted them, offered resources and expertise I hadn't known to ask for. I reduced my hospital shifts to part-time. I drove down to the property on weekends, then for longer stretches, then relocated entirely. The greenhouse got new glass panels first, because the orchids needed that before anything else. Then the farmhouse roof. Then the porch. I repaired things in order of necessity, not aesthetics, and by spring the property had stopped looking abandoned and started looking like something in progress. Marcus did not call for 4 months. When he did, it was brief. "I heard you're turning it into some kind of nonprofit," he said. "A horticultural therapy program," I said, "for hospital patients and families in the county. We're partnering with the hospital system in the next county over." A pause. That's he stopped. "Mom told me about the orchids. She said they were something. They are." Another pause. "Grandma would have liked that," he said. Not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, but something. "Yeah," I said. "I think she would." The opening ceremony was in early June. On a morning so clear and bright that even the rust on the greenhouse frame looked intentional, like something aged rather than neglected. The county commissioner came, and the hospital administrator, and a reporter from the regional paper who wanted to write about the orchid collection. Vera wore her good jacket and stood in the front row with her arms crossed, and her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she was trying not to cry. Mom was there too. She had driven down the night before and helped me set up chairs in the greenhouse. We had worked side by side for 3 hours in companionable quiet, stopping only when she picked up one of the lady's slipper orchids and held it up to the light. "She really did all this," Mom had said. Not quite to me. "She really did," I said. At the podium, in front of the people who had driven out to Miller Creek Road for this, I looked around at the greenhouse my grandmother had tended in secret for 4 decades, at the rows of orchids now labeled and documented and open to the public, at the 12 acres stretching out behind the glass walls toward a creek that fed downstream neighbors who had quietly paid into an account for years. I thought about my brother's face in the driveway on the day I told him it was done. I thought about what he'd said at the funeral. "A greenhouse. Fits you perfectly, Sarah. You always did love playing in the dirt." He hadn't been wrong about the dirt part. "My grandmother left me something she had spent 40 years building," I said to the people in the chairs. "And for a little while, I wasn't sure why she'd chosen me. She could have left me anything, and she left me a rundown greenhouse in the middle of nowhere that nobody in my family thought was worth anything." A few people smiled, but she wasn't leaving me a greenhouse. She was leaving me a practice. She was leaving me the proof that patient, sustained attention to living things produces something that can't be priced quickly or dismissed easily. She was leaving me the argument, the real argument against the idea that only what's flashy and fast and easily converted to cash actually matters. I paused. This program exists because she was right, and because she knew which one of us would understand that. After the ceremony, I walked out to the dock at the edge of the creek. The water ran low and clear over pale stones. Vera came and stood beside me without being asked. "You're going to need more staff," she said. "I know. And the east section of the greenhouse needs attention." Some of those specimens aren't getting enough indirect light. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Eleanor would have given you a hard time about the porch railing. It's still slightly crooked. I'll get to it, I said. Vera looked out at the water. You know what she told me? Right before she went into the hospital the last time? She said, and I'm quoting here, "The right person will figure it out. They always do." I didn't say anything. You figured it out, Vera said simply, and walked back up toward the greenhouse. I stood at the creek for a little while longer, watching the water. Marcus would move on to the next thing, whatever it was, because he always did. My mother would keep working her way back toward me, slowly. The way you cross a creek, by stepping stone to stone. The orchids would keep growing, because that's what living things do when someone pays attention. I reached into my pocket and turned the small ceramic planting tag over in my hand, the one I'd found pressed into the soil of the oldest specimen in the collection. In my grandmother's handwriting, not a name, not a note. Just 2 words. Keep growing. I put it back in my pocket and walked up toward the greenhouse, where the doors were still open and people were still moving through the rows, pausing at the rare specimens, leaning close to read the labels, asking the volunteers questions. I stepped inside. The smell of green and living things closed around me. I got to work.